Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit of Into the Breach in Retrospective. This one's going to be fairly quick and snappy because the game Into the Breach doesn't have a ton of content in it, and it's pretty quick and snappy in and of itself. So let's quickly clear out some stuff that I don't really care about, and that's of course the appearance and the music. These can be very important things in certain types of games, but realistically speaking, this has got that sort of indie 16-bit kind of style going for it. Now, there are games in this style that have really brilliant graphics, and actually FTL, which is made by these creators, has a really good look to it and a really good aesthetic to it that makes it visually interesting to look at despite the graphical limitations. This doesn't quite pull out the same really awe-inspiring graphics of it, but I feel as though I've been spoiled by games like FTL and by Kingdom. This game does have a decent look. It's very utilitarian. You can easily tell what all units are, what they sort of look like based off of their sprites, and making that large number of things distinct despite sort of the color coding and the fairly limited size of everything is a decent accomplishment in its own right. They've done a good job of making it so you can tell what everything is. Even when you've got like multiple, say, walker mechs or artillery mechs, you can easily tell what they are, partly because they've made good color decisions, but also because the unit sprites also look fairly distinct from one another. And all that together makes it so that the game is very easy to play visually. You don't look at it and find anything to be cluttered or confusing or difficult because of that. I do think that they could have gone out of their way to make it a little bit more aesthetically pleasing in one way or another, but it's an art style that I think definitely helps facilitate playing the game. By contrast, the music, I don't really remember it all that well. It's that kind of stuff that blends into the background and is designed, I think, to augment the experience and not really to take away from the experience. The music in this game, I think, was fine for the most part because it never really got in the way of what was going on. What sounded more impressive to me was all the sound effects that the units make. I do find that the in-game sound effects for damage, for critical damage, for your attacks, all of that I feel is a little bit more interesting in terms of the sound design than the music in this particular game. I just find that the music in this particular game, while good, isn't really outstanding. I think that FTL had a slightly better soundtrack, but again, the aesthetic design choice as well as the music are going to be very largely subjective, and this just isn't as interesting to me in terms of the style as it was in FTL. And we are going to be comparing them a lot to FTL because that sort of indicates to us what the sort of maximum potential of these developers is, because they made both of these games. I think a more fair comparison, if we want to stick to games that are similar in style, would actually be Invisible Incorporated. For a turn-based tactical game that's heavily sort of puzzle-themed, I think that Invisible Incorporated actually does a much better job of having a unique aesthetic style to it that really sort of gives you a good impression of it. The different individual models not only look unique from one another, but they also look very striking. I think that this one has gone for more of a retro vibe to it, in the sense that all the units do really remind me of things from Advance Wars, which had those sort of really chunky, cutesy sort of looks to them, and didn't really look that great necessarily, in my opinion, but I think that that's sort of the vibe that they went for, because that's a fairly popular game that I think inspired the developers to a certain degree. Might be wrong on that, but it was a very popular game for its time, and it's frankly one that I liked during the time that it came out. So moving on from there to the game mechanics, I keep calling this game more of a puzzle game than a pure strategy game, because it's almost entirely about very precise positioning and moving your units about in a very selective way to get maximum benefit from things like pushes and crowd control, which is very unlike what you would do in most turn-based tactical games. If you think about your Fire Emblems, your Advance Wars, it's mostly about unit positioning and attrition and damage dealing and having better abilities than your opponent, and having superior local force than your opponent. But none of those options really come into play in this particular game. This game is almost entirely about sending each of your mechs in a very precise way to a very precise location so that it can use its attack and prevent the enemy from dealing damage to your infrastructure. And this is a very unique take on it, and that has me a little bit conflicted on it. For one thing, it does mean that this feels more like a puzzle type game. It feels more like a type of Tetris experience in terms of what sort of brain cells you're working out when you're playing this game, as opposed to an Advance Wars or a Final Fantasy Tactics or anything like that. And that makes it interesting because there aren't really other games that I find work exactly in this particular way. And because of that being a unique experience is in and of itself kind of fun and worth trying out if you're interested in either tactics or puzzle games. And frankly, I like both. So this does work out quite well for me. I would prefer if it was a tactical game, but that's just personal preference. I know plenty of people who don't play any tactical type games as well. So I do, however, think that one of the limitations of the style is that because the mechs are so restricted, or not just mechs, but all of them are so restricted in terms of what they're capable of doing at any given time, it's so difficult to properly customize anything. You're often going to find that you don't have very good solutions to any good problem. So you are sort of cobbling together ideas and solutions. The other thing that I think is a bit limiting in terms of that is how quickly things escalate. You're seeing a Vex spawn pretty much every turn and you're on a very strict time limit. You have to solve the problem of the enemy attacking your buildings pretty much every single turn. So you don't have that sort of option to tactically position yourself so that you'll be in a really good spot for the next turn, since the sort of pressure that the AI puts on you is so constant and is so necessary for you to react to that you're not really being proactive in this game. You're only ever really capable of reacting to the AI to a large degree. I think there are a few proactive things you can do in terms of positioning, but the way that it seems to be coded, it's not a guarantee that the enemy is going to react to your positioning your units in any given way by specifically reacting the way you would want them to. So there are certain difficulties in trying to make this game feel more like a proactive measure as opposed to simply reacting to the AI rushing you. So the next thing I want to talk about is sort of the length of the experience, and that's kind of important in this kind of game. So this game was designed, I think, to be finished in about an hour, hour and a half, maybe 2 hours. And when I say finished, I mean to start a new game and complete a time loop. So this is going to be from stage 1 to stage 2 or 3 or 4, and then the final mission. And not including the fact that you're not likely to beat this game on your very first run. You might beat it on your very first run, I don't know. But broadly speaking, this game is designed for iterative play. You're not meant to sort of just play it through once and then be done with it. You're supposed to play it once, unlock a few things, try it again with something new, and experiment and experiment and experiment. And that's perfectly fine, but it does mean that the core gameplay loop itself is relatively short. Again, to compare it to something like FTL, getting from the first mission to the last mission only takes a very short amount of time. There's not a ton of interesting things that occur between them. Whereas in FTL, you have lots of these little micro events where it gives you a little bit of story for your personal ship and the crew, and maybe one of your guys gets eaten by a gigantic spider along the way. You rescue someone else to replace them from a slave trader. You can really develop a story from the events that happen in FTL, partly because of the way that it's structured, but also partly because of the length of it, the fact that you're able to sort of have your guys go on this longer journey and adventure before they reach the final conclusion. They have a saying, I guess, that it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. I feel like FTL really sort of understood that. I don't feel as though Into the Breach really gets that as much as it could. The individual levels and puzzles themselves are quite fun, but there's not a whole lot of personality to your squad. There are little bits of dialogue and so on and so forth that show up and crop up, but they don't really have that sort of personal story that you can tell about them that you could in FTL. And again, to be more fair, you could talk about something like, say, Invisible Incorporated, or maybe XCOM or something like that. Both of those games also feel like they have more organic storytelling about your squad, because you're able to last a lot longer. You're able to get a lot more attached to them as characters, simply because there's going to be more time spent with them. There's going to be more things happening, and it's not as catastrophic if you lose somebody in, say, XCOM, or you lose someone in Invisible Incorporated. So those sorts of games, I think, do a little bit of a better job in terms of presenting a long, cohesive story that gets you attached to the characters. This one, I think, is designed to be completed fairly quickly, and then you start over again with something else. And I really feel as though because of this, there's a little bit less of a sense of accomplishment when you do get to the end, because you haven't really completed a full journey, it feels like. Now, it does actually also help if you are a more casual player for it to be a shorter experience. I absolutely would say that this game, I feel, is much better when I'm not feeling up for a more complex game. If I felt like a more complex, in-depth experience that really drove me to try harder, I would be playing something like XCOM or Invisible Incorporated or FTL. Any of those games is going to require me to be paying attention for a lot longer. Is going to be a lot more draining of an experience, and is going to be a lot more upsetting when I inevitably get to the second last level and completely just screw up and get killed. So this game is, I think, a little bit more for a casual audience, and I think that that's perfectly fine. At the same time, though, because of the sort of construct of the way the game is played and sort of the way the puzzles are designed, I feel as though they could definitely have made this game more interesting for a longer playthrough if they had made the puzzles more diverse in the different levels. I feel as though the fact that they sort of constrain themselves that every single mission has to be, timer based with a very strict timeline, with a small number of enemies spawning in every single turn, where the primary objective is to make sure that you're defending these power grid buildings. If they had a mission, for example, where they stripped away the power grid for a mission, and you had to do something other than protecting infrastructure, that could provide an opportunity that would make something more interesting. If there was an entire island where they didn't need a power grid because of some science fiction bullshit reason, that could be very interesting. Or if they made one where Vec start on the map in very, very large numbers. There are a few that are like this, where they start off with Vec their throat frozen, and they slowly trickle onto the map by unfreezing. But even there, that's the same as them spawning in. But imagine a level where you don't have to protect any buildings, and there's like 10 Vec at the start, and you have to figure out, maybe it's a survival mission, maybe it's an extermination mission, but you're doing something other than simply protecting the grid for X number of turns, or protecting the train for X number of turns, or protecting the power plant for X number of turns. Throwing in some very, very different types of missions by removing the sort of core assumption of what a mission is supposed to be would allow them to extend the gameplay and make it interesting. So the fact that they've got the sort of maximum of 4 islands and the sort of probably standard of 2 islands before going to the last mission could be solved by making the islands individually more diverse and more interesting. And I think that they could probably get away with something like, say, 8 missions or something like that for extreme players, if they really wanted to, if they had gone this route of making sure that each of the islands gave you something really, really unique to play with. Related to that, I also feel as though the progression system in this game is a little bit wonky. While you can power up your mechs and the power-ups are meaningful, I do find that you end up at a point where it doesn't really feel like you're progressing really that much. I do feel as though it's because they start you with a limit of 3, and you never really advance beyond having 3 mechs. I do think that there should be some sort of gateway to getting 4 or even 5 on the field, depending on what you're doing, to allow them to have a very, very intense and very difficult final stage, rather than sort of having to balance the final fight around you having 3 mechs. Because broadly speaking, the final fight does play out very, very similarly to every other fight that you're going to get into in this game, because the objectives remain the same. It's defend an object and defend the power grid. and at the very least they could have made it so that you're absolutely swarmed with enemies. Now I'm aware that you can have things like tanks that you can chuck out, but the way that those work, they're not very effective, so it's often detrimental to sort of rely on that as a fourth party member. And since they also don't gain any natural level ups, it sort of weakens them as a conceptual type of unit there. So there's, I think, a lot of room for improvement in this particular game. For me, I think that the main crux of it is that the experience is short and sweet. It's designed well for what it is. But it's the sort of game that makes you want it to be extended as an option. I don't think that, if they do decide to make it so that there's 8 islands in some sort of future expansion, I don't want them to make it a requirement that I go from stage 1 to 8. I think that it's fine if 2 islands is a viable way to play the game. But I do think that it should be an option to go further and further and have that be more interesting rather than more repetitive. So I think that that's just sort of the way that the game is designed currently. Anyway, for the last thoughts here, what do I think of the game overall? I think the game is definitely worth playing. The stuff that they have got in there is very fun. It's just that the amount of stuff that's actually in there doesn't feel like it's that substantial. So this is a game where I would certainly recommend you get it on sale, because at its current price point, it is a little bit pricey for what it actually offers. So in any event, I hope you found this episode enjoyable, and of course, as always, I hope to see you guys all next time.